Okay.
My name is Welcome Wilson Sr., and I'm going to talk about World War II and how it affected those of us in Texas.
Start by telling me where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor.
On December 7th, 1941, my family and I had been out to a new place that we had purchased out of town, about 8 miles, where we were planning to move in a few months. And when we drove up, it was my brother and I was 13 years old, and my brother and I were in the car with my parents, and a friend of ours from school came running there saying, I'm volunteering, and we didn't know what the world he was talking about. And then he told us that the Japs had attacked Pearl Harbor. And the first thing we had to determine, where the hell was Pearl Harbor? Because nobody had ever heard of it. And then, so that was quickly clarified. So we rushed to the radio, which was the source of all information in those days, and listened carefully to the reports of the blast and so forth. It was a exciting time, and I remember my brother, along with half the nation, said, we'll beat them in 3 weeks. Those dirty Japs, we'll beat them in 3 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. Didn't turn out that way.
How did things change immediately after that? Did the whole tone of the country change, or did it take a little bit of time?
Well, let me answer that in 2 ways. One is, remember that the war had started in Europe in September the 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, having signed a treaty with them saying he wouldn't invade. So that's when England got involved and whatever, and it was right after that that Churchill was elected Prime Minister of England. And so we had been in sort of a war mode for some period of time because it looked inevitable. Although there were still those elected officials who were saying we've got to stay out and it's not our business, etc. But everyone got serious after December 7th. And everybody settled down and got busy on how to win this war.
You mentioned your friend saying he was volunteering. Was that the feeling across the board? Was there a big surge of that?
No question about it. And let me tell you that the one thing that was characteristic of World War II that I haven't seen since is patriotism was everywhere. Volunteers for the service, for example, people willing to make sacrifice. I often say today that we have farmed out our patriotism in America to 1% of the population that is over there fighting wars. And at home, we're unwilling to make any kind of sacrifice of any nature because of the war. We expect that 1%, and we think that we do our part when we stand up and applaud when a veteran walks in the room. But in those days, everyone was ready to put their shoulder to the wheel and so forth. And the optimism about quick victory was high. Turned out to be so wrong.
Let's expand on that patriotism and sacrifice that was going on here. Tell me about things like rationing and price controls and how that affected everybody's lives.
Well, remember, I was 13 years old, and when the war ended in 1945, I was 17 and a half. So my perspective is not like my mother or father's would have been, who were trying to keep food on the table and things like that. But my perception was that everyone was willing to make the sacrifice, and no one argued about it, no one complained about it that much. For example, we got 3 gallons of gas a week. 3 gallons of gas per week. So you had to be very careful where you drove. Gasoline was very cheap at the time. My recollection, it was about 14 cents a gallon. And I remember one time during the war that I ran out of gas. And all I had was 1 penny. And so I put that 1 penny's worth of gas in my tank, and believe it or not, I got 7 blocks on 1 penny worth of gas. So, but another thing that you don't think about, but American manufacturing converted to the war effort. So no one had automobiles, new automobiles. No one had parts for old automobiles. I remember buying shirts during the war. No new shirts had been manufactured for several years. So what the stores sold were detachable collar shirts. Literally, that they'd had left over from the 1920s. That's where I learned to tie a bow tie, because you couldn't get a regular four-in-hand tie. All they had set for sale was bow ties. So bow ties became very popular. There were no suits or things like that that you could buy. But maybe my perspective was off base because of me being a kid. I felt like that everybody was willing to sacrifice and so forth. Of course, my parents may have had a different point of view.
Do you remember your food? Did it affect, how did it affect what y'all had for dinner?
Well, the food situation, we've never had any shortages that I knew of, except, let me change that. Certain foods were in short supply. There were less fruits, less vegetables, because we didn't have people on the farm to work the fields. We had price rationing, and the only price that I remember was that, not price rationing, price control. The price that I remember was that coffee was 25 cents a pound. That's probably the only thing I can remember about price controls. But there was food, but you had to show up on time or it might be gone. So it wasn't, I don't remember any sacrifices regarding supply of food.
You mentioned nobody there to work the fields. In certain parts of Texas, a little bit later, they had the POW camps. Do you remember any of those in the valley, or was that too close to Mexico?
No, there were no POW camps in the Rio Grande Valley where I grew up. I grew up in Brownsville, Texas. From the time I was 12 years old to the time I was 17 and a half, or actually 18. And if they had any impact, it was bound to have been minor, because there just weren't that many prisoners of war. And they were all Germans, by the way.
Did the Mexican border make a difference? Were people, well, let me back up and ask you something else first. How was the troop population down in the valley? I know.
How was the what?
The troop population. Were there service bases down there?
Yeah, well, in Brownsville, Texas, we had Fort Brown, which was built after the war between the United States and Mexico, and it had a heavy population of soldiers in training for the cavalry. And believe it or not, they were on horses. So the American military was not very modern in 1941. So we still were training horses, training soldiers to use horses in combat. But they had a big impact on Brownsville. They were very good for local business, for one thing. And all the girls, local girls, loved dating the soldiers. And it also helped in the patriotism. For example, we would attend certain events at Fort Brown where they would parade and things like that.
So did the population of the city swell with soldiers? I mean, was it a noticeably busier place?
I would say we had no more than about 3,000 soldiers. And the population of Brownsville at the time was about 30,000 people. The population of Matamoros, directly across the street, was greater. It was probably 200,000 people. And by the way, it didn't seem to me that there were that many differences in the ability to go across the border. In other words, we were used to going on Sunday and having dinner next to the square in Matamoros, Mexico. And I don't remember any special precautions or security or whatever as a result of the war going on.
Tell me about bond drives and war bonds and things like that. Is that something that you remember becoming a part of life?
Very well. I spent most of the war as a newscaster on the local radio station. And the reason that I, at age 15, 16, 17, was a newscaster was that anybody qualified was in the military and gone. So all of the jobs were held by teenagers and older people. And it was a great opportunity for experience for a teenager. I was a disc jockey at age 15 and a station break announcer and then later a newscaster. And as a newscaster, it gave you the opportunity to keep up to the minute on the war. We had Associated Press at the radio station, so our newscasts were written by Associated Press in effect and just given by us 2 or 3 times a day. But it did give you an opportunity to know what was going on in China and all over the world.
How closely did, and I'm guessing this is an obvious answer, but tell me about the closeness that people would follow the war news and how much they kept up with that, how much it was a topic of conversation.
Well, the war news was closely followed. But what you have to remember is that we had censorship then. It wasn't like the Vietnam War, in a sense, when there is no censorship to speak of. And so most of the news was good. And now we know that that was totally misleading. For example, in the Pacific, the Japanese were beating us everywhere in the Pacific and literally running us out of the Pacific. Well, there wasn't that twist on it at the time. Everybody knew it wasn't going well, but no one knew what a disaster it really was. And so there was a lot of propaganda involved as well. For example, all of the movies were about the war, typically. And it would be our heroes winning the battles and things such as that. And it is reprehensible when you look back on it, but the Japanese and the Germans were portrayed as total villains. The Japanese loved to kill Americans and rape women and all that kind of stuff. And later on in the Korean War, I served in Japan as a naval officer and learned that the Japanese are the warmest, best cultured, most wonderful race of people you can imagine. They're a wonderful, wonderful race, family-oriented, hardworking, intelligent, and just a great group of people. Well, that's not the way they were